If you're new and I've never met you before, please feel free to send me an email and just introduce yourself with 2 or 3 sentences, how you found us, that kind of thing, whatever you want, just so we have some idea who you're here. And feel free to put in the chat box who you are, or how you got here. If you want, just briefly, I will be looking at all the chats at the end. If anything I miss now, I'll look at later at the very end. And the way this has been working, because as I'm learning how to do teaching online, I just want to let you know we're being recorded. You will not, your face will not be shown unless, I don't think your face will be shown in any event. So you don't have to worry about that, but just know if you speak, which there probably won't be chances for that, but if there are, just know your voice will be recorded. But what I have found has worked is when people put comments in the chat box, and I can, if they're short comments, I can usually follow them, or at some point I'll stop and I'll read through them. So feel free to put questions or short comments in the chat box. If you want to put a longer comment, feel free, and you guys can read it. I probably won't be able to read it during the class. I'll read it afterwards. So I'm going to jump in because I have a very lengthy text. It's a very unusual text that I come back to about once a year. I've been studying this text for many years. Some of you might have seen this text before. For others of you, this will be your first time looking at this text. The thing about Jewish texts, and I say this for the benefit of people who are Jewish and people who aren't Jewish, just so you know how my approach is, I don't read Jewish texts in order to like find out, and question, did it really happen? Didn't it really happen? That to me is not the point. To me, the point is that these texts are here to teach us truth with a capital T, some kind of capital T truth. And there's probably a grain of truth in every one of these stories, but that's not the thing that's the message. The message is going to come in the story, like any great literature, like poetry. We read this like poetry. We read this like something that's like, what's the message here? And these stories are often very concise, and they don't give us all the information, which is what makes them so rich, because we get to fill in the blanks. And this particular story is a story that has many blanks and is taught for people who are familiar with Talmud stories. Talmud, written down around the year 600. It's the major Jewish book that came after the Bible, and that Jews follow. Jews don't follow the Bible. We follow the Talmud, and what came after the Talmud. We follow the interpretive tradition. We aren't literalists. And that goes for whatever type of Jew you find. Literalists is not what we are. People interpret it differently, but we go through an interpretive lens, and we call that the rabbinic lens. And so this is a story about some rabbis. And remember, I want to just tell you, this is written down by the rabbis, right? They're the ones who are telling the story. And so keep that in mind. Why would they tell us this story? Okay, that's a question to think about. The key player here is Rabbi Eliezer, and he is a brilliant rabbi, lived, first century, second century CE, just to give you some time frame. The destruction of the Second Temple happened in the year 70. So this is after the destruction of the Second Temple. And he and his colleague, Rabbi Yehoshua, and this is on the sheet, by the way, I sent many of you got the sheet. If not, it's on, Rebecca's been putting the link in the chat box. You're welcome to just listen, but if you want to download this, all who these people are, I wrote at the beginning of the sheet, so you have it. So Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer were young rabbis at the time of the destruction, and their teacher was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the key leader of the time, who escaped from Jerusalem as it was being destroyed and created a rabbinical assembly that basically allowed Judaism to continue after the destruction of the temple. All right, so this is the context. These Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer were young colleagues. They saw the destruction of the temple. They helped create the next the possibility that Judaism would survive beyond the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And they are now in the leadership position. The head of the Rabbinical Academy at the time of this story is a man named Rabban Gamliel. And so he is the brother-in-law of Rabbi Eliezer. This is, everybody's related, right? It's hard to keep track of all these people. And we will meet some other characters along the way. Some of you might have heard of the famous Rabbi Akiva. He's one of the most famous rabbis in the Talmud. He is a student of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Okay, so, but the key player here is Rabbi Eliezer. And I'm going to walk us through this story and put on your seatbelt. Feel free to put in the chat box questions as we go. If you're not following, just like, well, who, what just happened? Feel free to ask that. And because I'm not in the room with you, and normally I'd have like posters and I'd be able to show you, and I just don't want to, I don't know how to do that here. So here's the story. The story is in the context of a conversation by the rabbis on verbal mistreatment. They talk about what's worse, verbal mistreatment or financial mistreatment. And they are very clear that actually you can repay financial mistreatment, but repaying verbal mistreatment is pretty much impossible. And so that's the context. Like, what happened when you hurt someone's feelings? And then we get this story. And usually they only teach part one. I wrote down here part one and part two. In the Talmud, there's no part one, part two. This is my division, right? And I'm going to stop at the end of part one, and you'll see why people usually stop there. But part two is the important part. Okay, so regarding this issue of verbal mistreatment, we learned elsewhere, and I'm going to make the English easier. So don't, I'm not reading literally. So just to make this more clear, regarding an oven that's been cut into segments where the sand is placed between each segment. Okay, they're deciding about the ritual purity of an oven. Now, just to make it clear, ritual purity after the destruction of the temple is just not as relevant. Because the temple's been destroyed, nothing can be ritually pure. This is not about good or bad or whatever, but they're in this kind of technical discussion. And there's just, and if we had tons of time, we could talk about like, what are they even talking about? But it doesn't matter. The point is that there's an argument. Is this oven ritually pure? And Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, it's pure. But all the other rabbis say, no, it's not, it's impure. Okay? Rabbi Eliezer on one side of this technical discussion, which we might spend a lot of time saying, why do they even care about this? And versus all the other rabbis say yes. I'd say no, it's impure. And this oven was called the oven of Achnai. Now, why is it called the oven of Achnai? Well, because the word Achnai means snake. And the rabbis, they made statements like snakes curling around and around, like they were like going like this in order to prove that it's impure, like a snake. So Rabbi Eliezer answered all their answers. They said, this is why we think it is. And he'd say, no, you're wrong. And this is why you're wrong. But the rabbis wouldn't accept his logical explanations. Right? So Rabbi Eliezer is being logical. The other rabbis are going, no. The third paragraph, after failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to the other rabbis, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, let this carob tree prove it. And the carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits. That's a measurement. And some say 400 cubits. Right? Clearly, this is not like a factual story, but this is like the carob tree is agreeing. There's like a miracle to say Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And the rabbis say, we don't get legal proof from carob trees. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, well, if the law is correct, the stream, this water will prove it. And the water in the stream turned backwards, going the opposite direction. They said, we don't get legal proof from streams. Like they're just complete, like as if these things are just normal. I mean, these stories are so fantastical, aren't they? Right? Then Rabbi Eliezer says, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, I'm on page 2 now, The walls of the study hall will prove it. They're in this holy place where they're studying. And the walls started leaning in and began to fall. And Rabbi Yehoshua, remember the colleague of Rabbi Eliezer, there are these two men who had carried Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai out of Jerusalem, these two colleagues. Rabbi Yehoshua stands up and says to the walls, if Torah scholars are arguing about something, what is it to do with you? Get it? It's not your business. And the walls stopped like this. The walls didn't fall in deference to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they didn't straighten up also in deference to Rabbi Eliezer. And then this wonderful line, and they still are leaning to this day. I mean, talk about resilience. Talk about flexibility. The walls will just stay in a leaning position. Like that is okay. But the rabbis, like, I'm thinking about resilience. I'm thinking about, we talked last week about flexibility. We talked about, being willing to be vulnerable. Talk about a vulnerable position, being in a building with the walls like this. But that's the way it needs to be in order to be in deference to both of them. But Rabbi Eliezer doesn't give up. He says to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a bat kol, a divine voice, emerged from heaven and said, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? The law is always according to his opinion. He's always right. This is a voice from heaven. At which point Rabbi Yehoshua, remember the colleague of Rabbi Eliezer, stands up and says, a quote from the Bible, it's not in heaven. He quotes the Bible against God. And what does this mean? It's not in heaven. He says, the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and we don't listen to heavenly voices, as you wrote in Torah at Mount Sinai. And then they give a quote completely out of context. Again, if we had more time, I could tell you how completely out of context it is. But he says, we go after the majority. That's what it says. So sorry, God, not your business. That's the end of part 1A. Part 1B. Years later, like what's God thinking about all this? Another rabbi years later came upon Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet, he's been gone a long time, but he shows up in the Talmud and he kind of meets with the rabbis along the way. He's a wonderful character. Another conversation. We should do a whole series on Elijah because what happened with him over time is fascinating. But he goes between heaven and earth a lot. And Rabbi Natan says to Elijah, what did the Blessed Holy One do? What did God do at that time when they were having this argument? And when Rabbi Yehoshua said, it's none of your business, God. Elijah said to him, the Holy Blessed One smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. And that's usually where we stop. And this is usually taught as a way to say, we as humans need to make our own decisions. We need, it's in our hands that we have to, we are supposed to interpret for each generation what is right and what is wrong and where things should go, how things should be. And this is a human endeavor, and God has given us the tools and God has given us the mind to do this. And that's usually that's how I always learn the story, stopping right here. What do you make of the story in terms of resilience at this point, in terms of flexibility at this point? Any thoughts? You want to just drop something in the chat box if you have thoughts? I'm going to just speak for a minute or two while people are having a chance to drop things in the chat box if they want. But one of the things that I think about is like that God is so willing to make space for us humans. And that's just, we've talked in the past about power differentials. Wow, yes. Does this mean that laws and rules can change depending on the cultural norms? In Judaism, yes, this is used to show that. Now, the question is, and what Jews will argue about is, what's the system for change? How much change? How quick is the change? What is a legitimate change? Yes, those are the questions that divide Jews, and we argue about endlessly. But that it can change. I mean, clearly it had to change because there's no temple anymore, and all of Judaism revolved around the temple 2,000 years ago, and we've lasted for 2,000 years since the temple was destroyed. So something had to change. And the question is, to what degree? And we can argue about that. But the change is possible, yes, and even necessary. I mean, God, I think, is amazing here. What I don't know when I finish the story is what happened, so like, how do they resolve the argument? We don't get the end of that story if we stop right here. Beth writes, it reminds me of current frustrations with some social justice initiatives. Humans don't always decide what's best for other humans fairly or equitably, and not always from the purest place. Correct. Right. So so this is a question of what is the motivation? We don't always know the whole story. I was like, why are they having such a fight over ritual purity? What are they fighting about? I would argue that it's not about ritual purity. Usually when we have really big fights, it's not about the thing we fought about. There's something else going on. And if this interests you, there's a great book that really looks at this, and I think quite well. It's I should have written it down. It's called Make Yourself a Teacher. If you like studying rabbinic stories, Make Yourself a Teacher by Susan Handelman. Really, she analyzes like what else might be going on here. Clearly, it's not just about ritual purity. Do they not have a concept of majority rules in the original past? Yes, they do. That's the point. There is a majority rule. Yes, but we also always cite the minority opinion in the Talmudic discourse, which is also something interesting to think about when you think about how can a society be resilient? How can a society where people have different opinions live with each other? You cite the minority opinion respectfully also. There's something not respectful going on here. That's the problem, I think. Judy writes, I immediately thought about the change in relationship with our adult children, letting them build their lives and making space for them to do that. God is modeling this. Yes, I think that's a beautiful, beautiful observation. That's right. And like in any relationship, where do we make space for the other? Let them grow up. Let them, as a teacher, my goal is never that you will always be dependent. My students will always be dependent on me. Like, what would be the best thing would be if, the students can go off and make their own decisions at some point, right? When I taught kids, is it a fight about power to decide the answer? Yes. So Hillary, that's really interesting because notice what they said. The bat kol, the voice from heaven said, but he's always right. So why don't you just go with him? So if one person is always right and you just always do what that person says, then the whole system falls apart. You need a system where you can have a back and forth where one person isn't always the decider. And that could be, that's one argument about what might be going on here. It's like, you can't, the rabbis, remember, this is very early in the rabbinic period. The temple was not destroyed that long ago. They're trying to create a system that will last into the future. And if one person, you think about any organization, if an organization is based on one person or one donor or one anybody, it's actually very dangerous. No matter how good they are and how well-intentioned they are, the future of that organization is at risk. So thank you, Hillary. I think that is possibly one thing that's going on here. It reminds me of being a parent, Claire says, of teens and letting them make choices. Yes, part of the story. Yes, Eileen, so Eileen, you're saying part of the story is this, I'm going back to what you said earlier to make sure the concept of majority rules is part of the story. Is that what you're saying? You can unmute if you want, or you can just write more in here.
I'm saying that the decider isn't always right.
Yes, well, that's right. The decider isn't always right, but in this case, God says he's always right. But that doesn't make him right. And then certainly we don't have a divine voice telling us, yeah, that's the person who's always right. So the truth is that none of us are always right, and we know that. So having one decider is really a problem. Monty says a contemporary tikkun olam question regarding contemporary tikkun olam questions, meaning fixing the world questions, and a sort of tough beat for Rabbi Eliezer. Yeah, it's going to actually get more complicated, Monty. Hold on. And why is Rabbi Eliezer so attached to being right? That is a really good question. And that's, I think, going to relate to what Monty's question. Right, the decider, yeah. Okay, I'm just going to read one last comment from Lynn, just that the rabbis are rediscussing this over and over represents our collective individual resilience and the profound resilience of the issue. God smiles at being triumphed. God is resilient and picks God's battles carefully. Yeah, nice. Well, it is interesting, like, that they keep discussing. One of the things I've noticed recently is that there are so many discussions in the Talmud and arguments about ritual purity. And this isn't the only story that ends badly, as you will see in a minute, over a discussion of ritual purity. There's other stories where friendships break up over this. I'm going to read the rest of the story, and then if we have time, I'll tell you about. I'll tell you if we have time. I'll tell you about another story that I was considering teaching today that I think is a parallel. All right, so part 2. Like I said, this doesn't say part 2 in the Talmud, but it's clearly not always taught, because now it gets kind of ugly. The sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items, the items deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven, and burned them in the fire. So everything that Rabbi Eliezer said was pure, they burned it. It's like, sorry, it's not enough. We have got to really erase this guy's decisions. And then they decided to ostracize him. He's going to be banned from coming back into the study hall. Wow. Do they need to do this? Is he the guy who just won't ever stop talking at a meeting, no matter he's lost, but he won't give up and can really destroy the whole system? Or is this the group that refuses to let somebody come in who has a different opinion? We don't know. All we know is they've decided he's banned. Now, this is his whole life. So this is not going to be easy for him. And the sages said, who will go and inform him that he's been ostracized, that he's no longer allowed back into the study hall? And Rabbi Akiva, who is his beloved disciple, says, I will go. Yes, and because if the wrong person goes and tells him in a way that isn't done well, he will destroy the entire world. Remember, this is a guy who just got a river to run backwards. He just got a tree to be unplanted. He got a voice, he's got the voice from his walls falling in. Like, he's got feelings. And remember, what's the context of this whole thing? Hurt feelings. The context of this conversation is hurt feelings. So what did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and wrapped himself in black, which is an expression of mourning and pain, and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits. A cubit is like from here to here, it's a measurement. So, it's a distance that you must stay away from an ostracized person. Rabbi Eliezer said to Akiva, what's different about today? Why are you sitting so far away, and why are you dressed like this? And Rabbi Akiva said, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. Meaning, and Rabbi Eliezer understood that he'd been banned. And Rabbi Eliezer ripped his garments, removed his shoes, as these are signs of mourning, and dropped from his seat and sat on the ground. Like he went into a position of mourning. His eyes, we're on page 3 now, his eyes shed tears, And as a result, the whole world was afflicted. Remember, the context is hurt feelings. And here's a man whose feelings are so badly hurt that the whole world is feeling it, whatever that means. 1/3 of the olives were destroyed, 1/3 of the wheat, 1/3 of the barley. Remember, Rabbi Akiva was afraid the whole world would be destroyed. So I guess Rabbi Akiva did it well enough that only 1/3 of all the crops are destroyed. And some say even the dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. And the rabbis taught there was great anger on that day. Any place that Rabbi Eliezer looked was burned. He could burn with his eyes. He was so hurt. I don't know if I feel badly for him. Does he know the power of his hurt feelings? Does he need to get some control over his hurt feelings? Is this why they had to ban him? Because he had this kind of, like, what is going on here? Even Rabban Gamliel, remember Rabban Gamliel is the head of the Rabbinic Academy, and he was the one in charge who was responsible for ostracizing Rabbi Eliezer. Interestingly enough, Rabban Gamliel had also been ostracized at another time because he was so stubborn, but he was allowed back in. And there's this whole ostracizing thing, like who's in and who's not in. What's so fascinating to me is that the rabbis are telling this story, and it's not a pretty story about themselves. So why would they be telling the story? This is not a pretty story about themselves. So Rabban Gamliel, he was on a boat, and a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. And Rabban Gamliel said, "It seems to me this is probably happening because of Rabbi Eliezer, because he knows God punishes those who mistreat others, and Rabbi Eliezer was feeling mistreated." Rabban Gamliel stood on his feet and said, "Master of the universe," talks to God, "you know that I didn't ban him in order for my honor. And I didn't ban him for the honor of my house, of my father, of like some kind of trying to like my purity, my own personal family needs, right? I did it for your honor, God. So that disputes, the reason they did it was so disputes will not proliferate in Israel. Like I did it because we were talking about what Hillary said before, like we need to have a system. And if we just, all we do is fight, there's no end to this. We have to have a system that works. And if he's in there, it doesn't work. So it was for your sake, God, so that we can move on. And the sea stopped raging. This seems to be accepted. So somebody asked about intention earlier. Rabban Gamliel says, this was my intention. This is why we did it. Is it okay still, even so? Did it have to be done this way? Was it necessary? Okay, meanwhile, back home, Rabbi Eliezer is home and he's alone and he's in pain because he's can't be with his colleagues, and he's like he needs to be with his colleagues. It's like, I mean, everybody here has something that their soul needs, right? He needs to study, teach, argue. The whole arguing system is part of like what he needs. Well, his wife, whose name is Ima Shalom. Now, Ima Shalom, if you know any Hebrew, means mother of peace. So we don't really know what her name is. But I'm really curious what people think about Ima Shalom. This story, there's rarely do people focus on Ima Shalom, and I'm also guilty of this. Like, what's her role here? How does she keep things going? Who is she? What does she represent? So Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was also the sister of Rabban Gamliel, the head of the academy. So now we find out that Rabban Gamliel, the head of the academy, has banned his brother-in-law. So this isn't just about two rabbis. This is a family issue now. So she's home with her husband, who has very bad hurt feelings. And from that incident forward, she would not allow her husband, Rabbi Eliezer, to say a particular prayer called the Tachanun prayer, which is when you entreat God for like how you're really feeling deeply. And she was afraid basically that if he would say how he really felt, if he could really say his full prayer, her brother would be punished and it would not be good. God would listen because God listen. We were talking, remember, her feelings are really taken seriously in the Talmud. But then it was a certain day around Rosh Chodesh, which is the new moon. To make a long story, this is a little bit complicated, but she thought it was a day when you weren't allowed to say this prayer. So she wasn't being so careful because she thought he won't be saying this prayer on this day because you're not allowed to say it on this day. Others say that somebody came asking for money to the door and she left him and gave him food. And I'm thinking like, well, yeah, there's people who are hungry because your husband just destroyed a third of all the crops. And so she's like trying to take care of people who are poor and hungry. But whatever the reason was, there was a moment when she wasn't watching him. And when she came back, she found him and that he was saying this prayer. His head was bowed. He was saying this prayer. All his soul was coming out in sadness. And she said, "Get up. You have killed my brother." At the same time, there was a shofar sound from the house of her brother, Rabban Gamliel, to announce that he had died. And Rabbi Eliezer said to her, "How did you know that your brother would die?" Like, it almost makes you think that that wasn't his intention. He was just pouring out his heart. And like, what made you think your brother would die? And she said, "This is what I learned from my fathers, the house of the father of my father. This was a tradition passed down to me. All the gates of heaven are locked." And this is like a tradition. This is actually this is part of this whole section of the Talmud. Since the destruction of the temple, the gates for prayer are locked, except for the gates of prayer for those who have been verbally mistreated. Or hurt feelings is another way to say it. The gates of hurt feelings. God hears the gates of hurt feelings. And that's the end of the story. Does not leave us feeling. I actually had somebody take a class with me on this story. She never came back. She said, "I just hated that story." I felt a little badly on one hand. The other hand, it's like, these stories are not here to make us feel comfortable. They're here to make us think and make us uncomfortable so that we can be better in the world. So what a tragic story. There's another story that I was referring to earlier, like Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And these are like the best study partners, and they just love each other. They show up on so many pages of the Talmud, these two guys, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. They come a few generations later. And they have a huge argument about something to do with ritual purity. And in the end, they both die from from being so badly hurt by losing kind of this argument, just not being able to work it out. Like, this is a system that works except when it doesn't. And so, you might say, like, why is she bringing this to talk about resiliency and vulnerability? I mean, I think there's a heck of a lot of vulnerability in this story. And it could have turned out differently. Maybe it couldn't have. Why would the rabbis put this in here? You see why I feel cheated that I was only taught the first half of this story? Like, yeah, it's all fine and good when God said, when does God laugh? God laughs when they're still arguing. But God doesn't show up. And, well, maybe God actually, I say something else.
May I share something?
Yeah, just 1 second. Let me just finish one thing here. Like, sorry. I just was going to say that the gates of, God doesn't show up, but maybe God does show up at the end. The gates of heaven are locked except for the gates of prayer. I don't know what that means, the gates of prayer regarding verbal mistreatment, regarding hurt feelings. I don't know. I don't know. I do think there's a message about vulnerability and resilience in this story, though. So I'll come back to that. But go ahead, Nancy.
I'm just kind of having an aha moment. I don't know very much about Jewish texts, but you know, wanted to take your classes to learn about resiliency, and in the middle of this, I'm hearing about hurt feelings. And my whole life, I've always been told my feelings are hurt too easily, and I didn't just rebound. And I've always heard just get over it from everyone my whole life, and I don't know how to do that. And this is kind of shedding new light on the fact that we're not wired maybe to just get over hurt feelings. They go deep, or this wouldn't be so important in the story. You
Yeah,
know.
well, clearly, yeah. Thank you, Nancy. I think this is telling us. I mean, we have many teachings about the power of of our words to hurt each other, and how careful we have to be about that. And the obligation is always on the person who did the hurting, not on the person who was hurt. You know, in terms of the text. I mean, the question is, you know, what is Rabbi Eliezer here? Like, has he gone overboard? I'm going to look at some of the comments in the chat. Feel free to drop more comments in the chat. So I'm going back to where I left off last. Margaret, maybe it's also a commentary on the limits of, I think that's from the previous section. We need to order our emotions in a way that's not self-oriented, even our religious and intellectual ones. Yeah, I kind of wonder, like, if Rabbi Eliezer could be aware of, like, his hurt feelings or hurting other people, right? There's other people's feelings that are important here, and he's obsessed with his feelings. Everyone's obsessed with their own feelings, except for one person, and that's poor Ima Shalom, who's stuck in the middle. We have to take responsibility. We also have to take responsibility for our feelings, and everything isn't black and white, Julie. Yes, I mean that's the beauty of these stories. People will often come to me and say, "Okay, so what's the answer? What am I supposed to do?" And I think, sorry, I mean, I can tell you what is. I mean, Jewish law tells you what to do, fine, and even within there's some gray, fine. But like, in terms of, like, it'll tell you, yes, you have to give, you have to feed the poor. You have to feed people who are hungry. That's no question. The question is how, in a way that is, that will preserve people's dignity. Like, what does that mean? The texts don't tell us how. They ask us to ask ourselves certain questions as we're making decisions that are going to be hard to make. There's no formula for interpersonal relationships. But there's things we should think about in interpersonal relationships. I think these stories are giving us things to think about in interpersonal relationships and show us what could go wrong. Like, some people read these stories as like, oh, okay, so we should be like, who are we supposed to be like? I don't think this is telling us to be like anybody. Yeah, the story is, Julie writes, the story is really sobering given the divisiveness of this time. Yeah, there is a consequence. And I think it's really important to show that nobody here is the good guy. Because whatever our politics are, we think we're the good guy. And if that's the case, I think this story is saying, wait a second, there's another side to this story. It doesn't mean that, I'm not going to, there's no moral equivalencies and that kind of thing, but there are human beings on the other side of an argument. And that's, these stories are telling us there's human beings on the other side of an argument with feelings. Hillary writes, previous week you mentioned resiliency depends on connection to others. Yeah, so hurting someone's feelings, ostracizing someone breaks the connection. Yeah, and I think, Hillary, especially for these rabbis, there aren't thousands of them. This is an intimate group. I mean, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer carried their teacher out of Jerusalem in a coffin as a way to sneak their teacher out of Jerusalem. This is another story, because of internal Jewish fighting in Jerusalem about how they should be responding to the Romans who were about to destroy the city. And the only way to get out, because the Jewish rebels wouldn't allow anybody out of the city, was to be snuck out. So these two guys, they were friends enough, colleagues enough to carry out their teacher. They saw what kind of destruction can happen internally within your own people. And then this happens. What's so interesting is that the rabbis are not that worried about the Romans, who did destroy the temple. I mean, technically. But they really see this sort of internal Jewish fighting as more dangerous. Monty, I wonder too how closely decisions about ritual purity in the Sanhedrin were monitored by Roman authorities. So Monty, it's so interesting you bring that up, because there's a whole theory that ritual purity is a cover for a completely different issue. And that issue is, should we live under Roman authority and just make the best of it, or should we rebel? And that's what the issue is. That's what they're fighting about. And interestingly, and because ritual purity has to do with whether or not, and I wrote this on the first page, whether or not the oven is complete. Is it considered complete? Because if it's complete, it can become ritually impure. Is it a complete item? And because it's got sand in between, is it a complete item or is it an incomplete item? I mean, so this gets technical, but Rabbi Eliezer is saying it's pure, which means it's incomplete. In other words, he's saying it's incomplete, and that's okay. He's arguing, according to one interpretation, that we should live under Roman rule and make the best of it, and it's okay. And the other guys are saying, no, we need to rebel. And that's what this is about. Which is another, then it becomes like a whole other conversation. And remember, this is also historically at the time period right before the Bar Kokhba rebellion. There was a rebellion against the Romans in Rabbi Akiva's generation. So this is already percolating. And so this might be the conversation is not about ritual purity at all. It's about the Romans. What should we do about the Romans? And so are the Romans monitoring their conversations? Probably, so they have to use the code. Beth, navel gazing is easily the universal default position. Yeah, well, it's hard to see out of our own, we could say, we're so horrible, but maybe, we should just accept that about ourselves and notice that about ourselves and then see how we can move outside of it. So there's a lot of comments here. We'll probably not get to all of them. I'll just read maybe a couple more because I want to get to the final page. I think being so isolated in the past 11 months, so much can also be misinterpreted by texts, emails, because we can't read facial expressions, mannerisms. And there can be valid abuse, but often I find people don't elaborate a text and there's so much misinterpretation and so much hurt feelings because we don't have that. And I think maybe, well, that's really interesting you say that, because you can think about Rabbi Eliezer, wherever he looked, it would burn, right? They couldn't even see, like there is something in the eyes, there is something in the interpersonal. Like, I don't know, like literally, did it burn, a third of the crops? That's not the point. Was it really a third? Was it, I don't know. But they're saying is that his hurt feelings there was a physical manifestation. And you know that you've been everybody knows, you get in a room with somebody who's really in pain, you physically feel it. Or someone who's really joyful, you can physically feel it. And it is something I think I'm missing, just that human energy that just like really literally happens. No one in the story uses words to communicate with each other except Ima Shalom. Well, no, Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva does too. But Ima Shalom, yeah, I think we should spend time another time just like thinking about poor Ima Shalom and why she's called Ima Shalom. And this poor woman who's stuck in the middle. I'm looking at Lisa as the mediator, right? Like, goodness. And of course, it's a woman. I mean, okay, another conversation. We're almost out of time, so I want to. You can keep putting comments in the chat. Rebecca, I am thinking in advance will save the chat for me, and I'll get a chance to read it afterwards. And I really look forward to seeing what you say, because as you can see, I don't know what this text is trying to say, other than maybe the rabbis preserved it so that they want us into the future to be resilient, to be more flexible with each other, to be aware of the fact that hurt feelings have consequences, that yes, it's in our hands, like God's laughing, yes, this is good, it's in our hands, but then what do we do with it? And how do we treat each other? And what is, Rabbi Eliezer wasn't flexible, but then neither were the other, like there's a lot of arguments to be made about a lot of people not being flexible here. And sometimes, I've been in a position where I felt like, okay, it's really clear this person has to be, cut. And then there's unintended consequences from it. And, it's you think you're doing what's right. And then, but if you keep the person in, there's other consequences, right? And so I was like, I don't want to be that person that they're trying to say, are we going to let this person in or not? So that's one piece of awareness that maybe this thing can bring us to. But the other thing is like, what might, thinking about the unintended consequences. So since Julie dropped this in the chat box last week, I wanted to just share it with you. The Place Where We Are Right by Yehuda Amichai, famous Israeli poet. And I just wanted to read it and then end with a quote from Rumi that also was dropped in the chat box last week. Rabbi Yehuda Amichai wrote, "From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, but doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood." Doubts and loves dig up the world.
Perfect.
And the ruined house, he's an Israeli poet. He's talking about many houses, but it's referring back to this time period, to the destruction of the temple, which according to some of the rabbis was destroyed because people were being too meticulous regarding law, and they weren't taking into account the human beings involved. And just to show this is not a Jewish concept per se, I think this is clear. These are not these are Jewish lenses into human issues. And Rumi, 13th century Sufi mystic, wrote, "Somewhere between right and wrong there is a garden. I will meet you there." I feel like these things, the Amichai and Rumi are talking to each other. And Rumi also wrote more expanded. I think, Clara, you dropped this in last week, so thank you. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. So may the world be too full to argue about. And I'm going to send you a survey. I would love feedback. Really would be helpful. Thoughts, comments, what you'd like to see in the future. And I just appreciate all of your participation and wish everyone well. Please fill out the survey. I would really appreciate it. Have a good week. And for those of you who observe Tu B'Shvat on, I think it's Thursday, the Jewish holiday of the trees, new growth, new hope, springtime. Let us hope for that. Have a good week, everybody. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.